Hello, welcome everyone. What a wonderful, active-minded audience we have. This is just fabulous. Thank you, Students for Liberty, for gathering everyone here and putting this fabulous conference on. So we're here to talk about liberty, and I want to talk to you today specifically about Ayn Rand's theory and views on liberty. Ayn Rand is the American author slash philosopher who wrote Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, books you may be familiar with. Also, Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, and several other books that are very pertinent to the ideas of liberty. So I want to talk a little bit about her theory of rights, but I want to begin by getting an understanding of what we mean by liberty, because that's what her theory is in support of. So just to get on the same page, by liberty, we mean a state of affairs or a political condition in which people are free to act on their judgment, right? To pursue the goals they choose and to use the judgment of their mind and to produce goods and to keep the fruits of their efforts, right? In this condition, people engage with one another only by means of persuasion, not by means of coercion. Coercion is out, right? So what does this mean in concrete terms? Well, it means that, for instance, you choose your own career. You want to be a doctor or a painter or a playwright, that is up to you. The government may not make that decision for you, as the government may under communism, for instance. Likewise, for contracts. You enter contracts on your own voluntary judgment, and you, whether it's an employment contract or whether it's a contract regarding your education or a real estate contract or any other kind of contract, you and the other party negotiate and you set the terms, and it's by means of mutual consent to mutual advantage. Likewise for sex. Consensual adult sex is a matter of choice. You and your partner can engage in any kind of sex you want. If you're gay, you may have gay sex. If you're straight, you can have straight sex. And the government and other people can do nothing to stop you. You are free to do that. You're at liberty to act on your judgment. That's why it's called liberty, right? Likewise for speech or freedom of conscience. You're free to hold whatever ideas you see fit to hold. You're free to express those ideas in writing or in speech or in drawing cartoons. And no one can stop you from doing that as long as you're not inciting violence or in some other way causing other people harm. You're free to do that. And it doesn't matter what other people think about your ideas, right? So this is what liberty is. And I know that you probably are all pretty familiar with that, but I just wanted to make sure, because I've heard different definitions of liberty, and that's the one I'm working with. It means that you are completely free to act on your judgment so long as you do not interfere with the judgment of other people that way. So who here thinks that liberty is good? Anybody think liberty is good? You think people should be free? Yeah, it's unanimous, right? But here's an interesting thing that's really important. Good and should are moral concepts. They're moral concepts. They bring these concepts, the question, should people be free, or is liberty good? These bring us down into the realm of morality. That's what it means to use those terms. So then the question is, well, what is the moral principle here that supports this idea that liberty is good and that people should be free? Is there a moral principle, and if so, what is it? Well, the moral principle is the principle of rights, right? We're all familiar with this idea that people have rights, the right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And the principle of rights is just sort of the summation of all of that. It's the idea that you have a right to act as your life as necessary to sustain your life. That's the right to life. You have a right to act on your judgment free of coercion. That's the right to liberty. The right to keep, use, and dispose of of property. And the right to pursue the goals of your choosing, things that will fill your life with joy. right to the pursuit of happiness. So that's the theory. But that's so far, that's just a theory that you have these. The idea is you have these, but is it true that you have these? Is it a fact that you have these rights? That's an open question still, at least so far in this discussion. So let's look into this. What are the traditional or the conventional theories about where rights come from and how they're validated? Well, there are essentially three. There's the God-given theory of rights, the government-granted theory of rights, and the theory of natural rights. And I want to talk briefly about each of these because all three of them are really problematic. Like they don't solve the problem of anchoring rights in reality. And this is a real problem, and we can see it very quickly. So we'll take God-given rights first. In order to prove that you have rights that come from God, what do you first have to prove? That God exists. If your rights come from God and you're going to prove that you have these things, the first thing you have to do is prove that God exists. This is a tall order. In fact, it's such a tall order that it's never been done. Regardless of your view on whether a God exists or not, I think we can all agree, no one has proven that God exists. This is why religion has this concept of faith. The whole point of faith is that you can accept ideas for which there's no evidence. There's no evidence in support of them. That's the purpose of faith in religion, is so that you can accept ideas when there's no evidence. Well, there is no evidence for the existence of God, so people have to accept them on faith, which means that this whole theory of rights is faith-based, not fact-based. It's not evidence-based. So if you're gonna hang your liberty and rights hat on that, you're gonna have trouble because then the socialists come along and say, well, we're gonna make you do X, Y, and Z, and you say, no, I have rights. And they say, well, prove to me that you have rights. And you say, well, they come from God. And you say, I can't see God. You see the problem. This is a big problem. You cannot defend liberty that way. It's just impossible. So what about the government-granted theory of rights, this idea that rights come from government? Well, this is a big problem, too, because, and I don't know what it's like here in Spain on this count, but in America, where I come from, the leftist, socialist types just hang everything on this. They're like, there's no such thing as rights. Unless you're talking about government-granted rights, sure, you can do what the government permits you to do, and you can't do what the government says you can't do. There are your rights, all right? Well, this means that if you lived in Nazi Germany and were a Jew, you had a right to go to the concentration camps because that's what the government said you had to do, right? I mean, this is just absurd. So what's the problem with this theory that your rights are whatever the government says you can do? It's a complete bastardization of language. The purpose of the concept of rights is completely different than the purpose of the concept of law. They're conflating rights and law here, right? What the government says you may and may not do, that's a law, that's not a right. The purpose of the concept of rights is precisely to be the thing that precedes government. That governments are formed to secure these things. Rights are moral prerogatives, that's the idea, if they exist. Now maybe they don't exist. Again, that's still an open question. But the notion that rights are government granted is just a complete bastardization of language. That doesn't make any sense at all. The government makes laws, and whether or not we have rights is another question. If we do have rights, then whatever those rights are will inform what laws ought to be and which laws ought not to be, but they're not the same thing. So this brings us to the third theory of rights, and this is one you're probably all somewhat familiar with, and you may all, to some extent, embrace, and that's the idea that rights are natural, or that they're somehow innate in us. But this is really problematic, too. And again, we can see so pretty quickly, and I'm sympathetic to this idea, but it is problematic because, so this is the idea that was very popular with the American founders. It was basically their idea, and John Locke held that we have natural rights. And the idea is that there's a natural law. There's a law in nature that says, in effect, that human beings should not use force against each other to acquire property or the like. So it sounds pretty good. But the problem is, if you go looking for these rights in nature, you don't find them. If you go looking for this moral law, what you find is that the whole theory actually is not really about natural moral law. Because do you know where the natural moral law that John Locke and the US founders comes from? You know where they say it comes from? From God. The idea is that there's a natural moral law created by God, and because of that law, you have natural rights. But you see, this is not natural rights. This is just supernatural rights, one step removed. So we're back at the same problem that we had with God-given rights. Because if you think about it, if the idea is that rights are somehow inherent in us, well, if you cut me open, are you going to find rights in there? You find a bunch of other gooky stuff in there, but you're not going to find any rights in there. And if you go out in nature and start looking around for rights, you're not going to find them there. So there's a real problem here, because there appears to be no evidence for the existence of rights. There's just people claiming that they come from God, people claiming that they come from government, and people claiming that they come somehow from nature, but when we investigate that, what we find is that they really mean they're coming from supernature. This is why thinkers such as Jeremy Bentham have said that the idea of imprescriptible rights, of inalienable rights, is nonsense upon stilts. Have you all heard that phrase? And Alasdair MacIntyre, a philosopher, has said that belief in rights is one with belief in witches and unicorns. Why? Because there's the same amount of evidence in support of all of them. Zero. All right? So this is a real problem. If we can't defend rights are the moral principle that liberty allegedly rests on. The idea, at least, that liberty is good. Now, liberty can exist for a period of time, perhaps. That just means that people are free. But the idea that people should be free, that ties to rights. That's a moral issue. And there's either evidence to support this idea or not. So, the problem, fortunately, has been solved. And this is what I want to talk to you briefly about, and that is Ayn Rand's theory of rights. Ayn Rand took a completely different approach to rights than anyone else had before. Instead of looking out and thinking that they must come from God or the government or nature out there, or even in here, she said, well, wait a minute, what is this thing we're talking about here? What is the nature of this being that we're concerned with? Man, people, human beings, individuals. What are we? What is the essence of our nature? And what she realized by observation and logic is the same thing that Aristotle realized by observation and logic, and that is that human beings are essentially creatures whose basic means of living is reason. It's their mind. It's their reasoning mind. And we can see this, right? All of the goods and services that we use to support our lives, from agriculture to engineering to food, clothing, shelter, to the arts, creating plays, creating music. All of this is done by means of our use of reason. Reason is our basic means of living. That's the kind of animal that we are. And the entire history of humankind is evidence to this fact. So this is not really a debatable thing. You can just see that it's true. So then Rand asked herself, well, what can stop a human being whose basic means of living is reason? What can stop him from acting in accordance with his rational judgment? And then she observed that there is only really one thing that other people can do to stop someone from acting on his judgment, and that is to use physical force against him. All right? Whether strapping him to a tree so that he can't do the things that he had planned to do that day, or putting him in a cage, or putting a gun to his head, or using indirect forms of force, such as fraud and extortion. In each case, what you're doing is you're stopping the person in question, the person who the force is being initiated against, from acting as he would if you were not initiating that force. So you're retarding his process of acting on his rational judgment. And if you do that to small degrees, you only retard his life to a small degree. If you do it absolutely by putting him in jails, tying him to a tree, or putting him in a concentration camp, then you have done it to the maximum degree, or perhaps death would be the maximum degree. But the point is, there are degrees of force, but all degrees of force retard human life, because our basic nature is to act as human beings on our judgment. That's what we are. That's how we live. So, said Rand, we need a principle. We need a principle that specifies the fact that human beings, including governments, may not initiate force against each other. That it's just morally wrong for anyone to do that. Why? Because it stops us from being the kind of thing that we're supposed to be. It stops us from living by means of our judgment. It stops us from living a fully human life. And this is the principle of rights. And it comes from observation and logic. The basic principle is this. The principle of individual rights is the recognition of the fact that in order for a human being to live fully as a human being, he or she must be free to act on his or her judgment. That's a fact. We can see that this is true. You can see the logical steps to this. Now, there's more to Ayn Rand's theory, and I'm giving you a very short, sort of a snapshot of it today. But it's important to understand that this is an all-new theory. This is completely different from the God-given, the government-granted, and the so-called natural theory. And it's a real evidence-based logical theory. I like to differentiate it from natural rights only because the history of natural rights is too tied in with supernatural rights. Otherwise, it might have been a fine term. I like to distinguish it by calling it the objective theory of rights. And it's objective because it's based on fact, right? It's the recognition, that's the in your mind part, but it's a recognition of external facts that we can see. We can observe that human beings live by means of reason. We can observe that if force, and to the extent that force is used against them, that it retards their ability to live by means of reason. And therefore, we can observe that we do indeed need a principle. We need to recognize this fact, codify that into a principle, and uphold it as a fact-based requirement of human life in a social context. And this is what Ayn Rand did. This is why this theory is so beautiful and so important to the liberty movement. If we want to defend liberty, we need to be able to specify why it's moral that we are free, why we should be free. And it's not enough to say we should be free and I know not why. I don't understand the moral principles why. Or it comes from God and I can't prove it. Or it comes from government and that's a contradiction. Or it comes from nature somehow and I just don't really know what that means. You can know what it means for rights to be derived from observation and logic. Ayn Rand has laid this out for us. And it's a really powerful piece of knowledge to have. So I urge, how much more effective would the liberty movement be globally if the majority of people advocating liberty understood this theory fully, reiterated it to new people coming in, argued on the basis of this theory with people who want to squelch our rights or violate our rights? How much more powerful would the movement be if we could prove that we have rights rather than merely assert that we have rights? I contend that we would be a whole lot more powerful. And this is why I'm so adamant about this. This is why I've built my career around advancing this and related ideas, this idea that there is a fact-based foundation for individual rights. So there's a lot more to say on this. I want to leave some time for questions today, so I'm going to close with just some recommendations. If you want to read more about Ayn Rand and her ideas generally, first of all, I really advocate that you read her fiction, especially if you love fiction. And her magnum opus is Atlas Shrugged, which is just a fabulous, fabulous story, filled with ideas about all various aspects of human life and philosophy. And it's fundamentally about the role of man's mind in life. But you see in there all of the ideas that I'm talking about today, you see them all dramatized in that book. At the objective standards table out here, there are Spanish editions of Atlas Shrugged that were done just recently, so you can find those there. The other books of Rand that I recommend highly on this count are The Virtue of Selfishness, which is her main book where she spells out her moral theory, and that has a lot of stuff in it as well about rights. And then Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal is another book that focuses kind of on the rights and the political element of her philosophy. And then lastly, I'm the editor of a journal of philosophy, culture, and politics called The Objective Standard. And I urge you to look us up online. I've written an article titled Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights, which you can find just by searching that on Google. It'll pop right up, and that's free. And it goes into some more detail about what I've talked about today. And if you are a student and cannot afford a subscription to The Objective Standard, just send us a note by our contact page, and we'll set you up with a free year subscription. We want you guys to know about these ideas, so we don't want you to be held out from that for financial reasons. Many of the articles at the website are available for free anyway, but a lot of them are behind the paywall, and if you just send us a note, we'll hook you up with that. So that's my presentation for today, and we can take some questions. We have about 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. I can hardly see, so if you do have a question, raise your hand high and kind of move it around. Yes, in the I think red, there are two right in a row there. I'll take the guy in the back first. Second row.
Great speech, thank you very much. Regarding the second theory of rights that you gave, the state-given one, the strongest counter-argument might be that we all live in a society and there's a social contract that we implicitly sign if we want to stay in that location, in that society. What would Rand say in response to that? What would her counter-argument be to that counter-argument?
So did you hear the question? The question is about social contracts. Some people claim that there are social contracts that bind us to a society and its particular laws, whatever they happen to be. I take it that was part of the question.
Yeah, if I want to live in a place with 100 people and 99 of them say that I must abide by a certain law, how do I get out of that? What's my...
Okay, got it. So if he lives in a place and 99% of the people want to, or 99 people want him to abide by a certain law and he doesn't want to, how would Rand answer that? Well, Rand would say that the principle of individual rights, the fact that people need full freedom to live fully as human beings, dictates which laws are legitimate and which laws are not. The only legitimate laws are laws that protect individual rights and do not violate rights. So any law that constitutes the initiation of physical force against a human being would be an illegitimate law. It should be removed from the books. And so your retort to people in that society would be, if they're asking you to live under rights-violating laws, your retort should be, but your laws are immoral, and morality trumps politics. So we need to change these laws and pull them in alignment with the actual requirements of human life. You would have the moral high ground if your position was that you wanted laws that protect rights. If it was the other way, and let's say you want to violate rights, and they're saying, no, you can't do that here. And you say, well, I don't like your laws. I'm an anarchist. I won't have anything to do with your laws. The people get to say to you, well, it doesn't matter whether you like them or not. This isn't a matter of opinion. The factual requirements of human life are such that we have to have freedom, and we have a government here that is protecting rights so that we do have freedom, and if you don't like that government, you're free either to leave or to stay and not fund the government. But you can't get out of its laws if you're within its borders. meaning that if you do violate rights, you can't say, well, I don't recognize your government. The government can say it doesn't matter whether you recognize the government. You violated rights. You're going to court. So take it either way, but the only legitimate laws are laws that actually protect individual rights. The gentleman in front of him?
One thing is that you say that the objective moral theory, the objective theory of rights from Ayn Rand is based on facts and evidence. But also, somebody can say 100 years ago that everything that you see is based on slavery, for example. And right now, somebody can say everything that you see was produced under a government. So somebody can say that everything, a government is required to produce everything that you see. And they can say also that this is a fact. What would be the answer to that?
I unfortunately was not able to make out that question. Your accent and the low volume here was difficult. Did anyone nearby who can speak English without an accent hear that and can reiterate it? I hate to do it that way, but that'll speed it up. Yes, gentleman right here.
So I think if I kind of caught the gist of what he's asking you, he rebuts this idea that he's putting out a hypothesis to say if somebody comes to you and says, well, liberty is all good and well, but everything that you see now, and the factual basis for your claim that liberty is the only rational way to structure a society is that people in the past had their liberty taken away from them so that we can live under this factual set of circumstances, right? So you mentioned slavery, right?
Yeah, and today government, like, it's the fact, you say it's based on fact and evidence.
Yes.
But right now somebody can say everything that you see was built under a government. So they can say this is a fact and evidence that a government is required to have everything that we have right now.
Okay, so because what we have today culturally and in terms of values and goods and services, it was all built under a governmental structure. So you're saying, does this undermine this idea that rights are objective?
Yes, correct.
Okay. No, it really doesn't, because whether things are built under a government structure, whether it's a good government structure, like a rights-protecting government structure, or a really bad government structure, like a communist government structure, whatever is built under those structures does not change human nature. It doesn't change the fact that in order for us to live fully as a human being, to pursue the goals that we want, to make our lives great, to engage with other people in creative and productive ways on a voluntary basis, all of those things, which are really factual requirements of human life, none of that changes under various social systems. It's just the case that some social systems recognize that idea more than others, and there's yet to be any social system that recognizes this idea fully. What we need is a social system that recognizes this idea fully and just does one thing. You have a government that protects rights and does nothing else. And so, and no past history changes the nature of the requirements of human life. Yes, and I'll come back to you next. Yes, right here.
Okay, so if the Randian ideas, which are almost closer to 150 years old, same for the 300-year-old ideas of John Locke are so right, isn't it a bit arrogant to say, both for classical liberals and Randians as well, that our ideas are so powerful and so correct, yet we don't see societies or hardly any people around ourselves that do believe in these right ideas?
Okay, so is it a little bit arrogant to say that John Locke had erred? Is that the? But let me just make sure I understand that. Are you saying that isn't it kind of a little bit arrogant to say that John Locke didn't really get it right?
No. Isn't it arrogant to say that we all did get it right, but the world does not?
Oh, yeah. So is it arrogant to say that we get it right, like we know the truth, but the other people are just kind of too ignorant to get it?
And we are such a small minority.
And we're such a small minority. Well, here's the thing, and you guys got to give yourselves some credit, right? You're here, and you're active-minded, and you're trying to understand what liberty is and how to defend it. And you guys are kind of, to use the proper technical term, you're kind of freaks of nature, in this way, right? Because most people don't concern themselves with this. And it's unfortunate that not many people concern themselves with this, because that's why we have all sorts of political problems, because so few people think actively about politics. But the fact of the matter is that we're not going to change the masses, ultimately. We're not going to change huge swaths of people. What we're going to do is we're going to be able to create a small minority, and maybe a slightly larger small minority, of people who really do understand these ideas. And those are the kinds of minorities that actually change history. Look at the Founding Fathers. This was a small minority of people that went up against a huge, robust kingship with a massive, navy, and they won, right? And they won because they had moral principle behind them, and they didn't have the full understanding that we have with Ayn Rand's theory now, but John Locke's theory was pretty damn good. If you've read his second treatise, he had some really good stuff in there, and the founders grabbed that and they were like, yeah, we have rights, and we can explain them to some extent. Now, they claimed that rights were self-evident, which is not true. We can look around, you can't see them. And they claimed that rights come from God to some extent, and that goes nowhere. But that theory that they were using did suffice to found America and to create a beacon for the rest of the world to see that, hey, at least moving in this direction is a good thing. What Rand has done is she's kind of given us the full grounding of this idea of individual rights so that we can now see and prove that it's true. And that changes everything, but it only changes everything if we embrace it and use it. If we don't embrace it and use it, then the history will be what it will be without that. Unfortunately, I'm told that, do I have one more? No more? Okay, I have to stop, I'm sorry, but I can chat up here with anybody who has questions. Thank you. Or out there. Thanks.